Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Sherlocktober. This is our next week in Sherlocktober, where we're reading through choice bits of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes canon. The first week we did a collection of short stories from the first short story collection. The second week we did more short stories. This week is an exception. This week we're doing a novel, sort of a hark back to the end of September when we first fell in love with Sherlock Holmes. But this time, we're not doing just any novel. We're doing not only the most famous Sherlock Holmes novel of them all, but one of the most famous novels of them all. This is started appearing in 1901. It's The Hound of the Baskervilles. And it was a big deal. It was a huge deal for London readers, for readers around the world, because it had been 8 years. It had been almost a full decade since Conan Doyle allegedly killed off this character. And grappling in the arms of his arch nemesis, Professor Moriarty, in the Reichenbach Falls. That was the adventure of the final problem, which was the last thing that we read. And Doyle let it go. He thought the character had played out. He thought he had done all that he could with the character. And he led a very vigorous 8 years after that story. He had all sorts of personal revelations and tragedies and advancements, went to war and came back. But the public demand for Sherlock Holmes never lessened. In fact, it grew with every passing year. And finally, Doyle had to accede, and he wrote this novel, which is not the return of Sherlock Holmes. It is sort of a prequel, I guess, would be the modern term for it. It is an adventure of Sherlock Holmes, but it takes place before the final problem. And readers who might have been howling about that in the first installments might have saying, "Oh, come on! I want to know what happened to the Reichenbach Falls. This isn't. You can't just pretend that didn't happen. You can't just give us a prequel. We want the character back, not the backstory of the character." Readers who might have been tempted to think that were quickly silenced because, oh boy, is this a good novel? Oh boy! I mean, right from the beginning, it is just terrific. When Holmes and Watson are in 221B Baker Street and they receive a visitor, a country doctor, who wants to consult with Holmes over the death of one of his patients, a member of the Baskerville family, the head of the Baskerville family. And the doctor has come well armed. He's come with an old document, centuries old, detailing the curse of the Baskervilles, that from a horrifying incident centuries before, in which the Sir Hugo Baskerville, the particularly evil exemplar of the line, was killed by a giant spectral hound on the moor. Since then, tragedy has followed the Baskerville family. In fact, we get a wonderful passage in that letter. Such is the tale, my sons. The writer of the letter has told the story of Sir Hugo being killed by a gigantic hound. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not forever punish the innocent beyond that third and fourth generation which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours in which the powers of evil are exalted. And at first Holmes is scoffing and says, well, it might be of interest to a collector of ghost stories, but it's of no interest to me, until the country doctor tells him that the latest head of the Baskerville family has been found dead in the yew arbor of his mansion at Baskerville Hall. And again, Holmes is slightly baffled as to why this would be of interest to him, and says, well, were there footprints near the body? And the doctor says yes. And Holmes says, well, were they male or female? And the doctor says, they were the footsteps of a giant hound. That is when you know that Doyle was cut out to write these stories. He might have had literary aspirations elsewhere. He may have had dreams that extended to the stage or whatever, but he was made to write these stories. That is just wonderful. And you are hooked. Well and truly hooked. And Holmes tells all concerned, not only the doctor, but the heir to the Baskerville fortune, who is an American. He's been living in America his whole life. So Sir Henry is not accustomed to English ways. He certainly is not familiar with the Moors or with Baskerville Hall or with the servants who live there and have secrets of their own. When he comes over from America, it's clear he's being followed. It's clear that something odd is going on and that his presence is unwelcome, perhaps by more than just the spirits that unleash the hound on his ancestor. But Holmes quickly announces to Sir Henry and Watson that they must go to Baskerville Hall and essay the lay of the land on their own. He has business in London. You don't believe him for a minute. You just think that he can't be on the scene, or his presence will alter the facts of the case, and he doesn't want that. One way or another, he tells Watson to keep him apprised, and that's a perfect gimmick to have Watson writing letters and observing everything. And the action moves to the great Grimpen Mire and to Baskerville Hall and its scanty inhabitants all around, the inevitable gypsies, the husband and wife who are the caretakers of Baskerville Hall, the neighboring families, the member of one of whom is an avid lepidopterist who seems to bear a striking resemblance to the Baskerville ancestor paintings in the hall. What could that mean? And it just builds from there, and it is the best combination. There are storms on the moor, there's a murderer on the loose, there's all sorts of pathos and bathos, and of course Holmes makes a triumphant reappearance as a figure on a tor out in the middle of nowhere. It's all so masterfully done that you understand before you're even halfway through. It's not a long novel. I'm trusting that all of you had no trouble reading it in the time that we allotted, just a week. It flies by. But you have no trouble telling even halfway through why this would have gripped the imagination of so many people, even me. It's even a favorite of mine, even though the Hound is the loser. Of course, it's not a spectral hound. There's no specter in the Hound of the Baskervilles. It's just an actual hound who's starved and tortured and covered in phosphorus and is killed, of course. The story ends with the death of the Hound. But I didn't care. I'm sure that other readers didn't care either. It's so effective. And books have been written about it. There was a very famous Sherlock Holmes pastiche novel called The Return of the Hound. And it's also been staged and filmed so many times because it's such a killer of a story. You want to know what's going on. Obviously, the Hound is not supernatural. As Sherlock Holmes puts it in a slightly different context, we are firmly present in the here and now. Ghosts need not apply. But you want to know what has set this whole mechanism in motion. Who is cynically playing off that Baskerville legend and why? And although Doyle makes it pretty clear in his narration right from the beginning that the heir, straight talking, normal American Joe, Sir Henry, is not a suspect, that he in the hands of a lesser writer he would be one of the suspects, but no, it makes it pretty clear that's not. But you still have no shortage of suspects. And I'm curious to know, those of you who are doing Sherlocktober with me, again, especially those of you who are reading The Hound of the Baskervilles for the very first time, you must have heard of it many times. You can't not. I'm curious what you make of it. Because one of the things that, when you're born aloft by Doyle's writing talent here, he is in such complete command of his narrative that you really do feel carried along. And when you're carried along, sometimes, especially in your first reading, you can miss the fact that the dots don't quite connect on this story. There's quite a bit here that I hesitate to say it in the presence of the master, but there's quite a bit here that doesn't really logically follow. There's quite a bit of word taking. Holmes and Watson, Sir Henry, they tend to take the word of a couple of key players in this story when there's nothing but that word else. There's nothing other than that, than their contention that anything happened the way they say it did. I'm wondering, I guess, what my main question for Sherlocktober this time around is, did you like the conclusion of The Hound of the Baskervilles? Did it convince you? Or did you finish The Hound of the Baskervilles and think, wait a minute, what about so-and-so? Or wait a minute, how do you know that? Who says so? You have a vested interest. There are a couple of characters I have in mind when I'm saying there are a couple of individual confessions and elaborations that I have in mind. I'm wondering if you will have spotted them too. I don't, of course, want to spoil the ending if you're still toiling along. And I also don't want to lead you, if you finished it, I don't want to lead you with my own suspicions. So this will be another case where the talk in the comments field, or an email or in text messages, will be wonderful. I want to know how this worked on you, because this is the Sherlock Holmes that people know if they know nothing else. If you talk to somebody who knows nothing about Sherlock Holmes, has never read or watched any Sherlock Holmes, chances are they will mention something about a hound, the hound of something or other. And that is reinforced because Toby, the great sniffing dog, makes an appearance early in the Holmes canon, and that links Holmes with dogs. And there's also the very famous Holmes quote about the incident of the dog in the night, that's also dog imagery is associated with Holmes. He's called a sleuth hound, but it's not just that. It's not just that this is so famously associated with Sherlock Holmes. I think it's also that it works. It wouldn't matter if it was such a marquee thing if it didn't work, but it really does as a story. And I want to know if it worked on you, especially the ending. Did it hang together to you in the same way as, for instance, The Sign of Four or Study in Scarlet, the two previous novels that we've read? And that wraps up Sherlocktober for this week. And of course, we're done with Sherlock Holmes novels this time around. As always, next year. This time around, we're done with Sherlock Holmes novels. So next time up, we will be reading The Return of Sherlock Holmes, which, as the title indicates, is Doyle finally realizing, I cannot kill this character. An old friend of his told him halfway through that 8-year hiatus, he said, you have created something immortal. You can no more kill it than anyone else can. Why not write it? Why not write more? In our next read-along, the next weekend, we finish up Sherlocktober with The Return of Sherlock Holmes, which is a collection of actual short stories, the first of which, The Adventure of the Empty House, begins with the return of the character. So there's, that's no spoiler. That is right there. It's right there in the title of the collection. And The Adventure of the Empty House starts wonderfully. It is just a wonderful story, and I'll be curious to know what you make of it. But anyway, in The Return of Sherlock Holmes, we're going to read The Adventure of the Empty House, The Adventure of the Norwood Builder, The Adventure of the Dancing Men, particular favorite, The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, and The Adventure of the Second Stain. And that will wrap up our Sherlocktober for 2018. That's what we'll do next. 6 short stories. But for now, I want to hear all about what you thought about this novel, the most famous Sherlock Holmes novel of them all. Especially those of you who are finally reading The Hound of the Baskervilles for the first time. Did it work? Did you love it? What did you love about it? I find it hard with literature like this that I have read so many times. I find it hard to step far enough back to not just blanketly love it all. I have reread The Hound of the Baskervilles so many times in so many places, in so many stages of my life, but it's hard not to think of it as just part of my mental furniture. So I'm extra curious, those of you who aren't that familiar with it, what did it do for you? And that is it. That is Sherlocktober for this time around. We'll meet one last time next week. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.